Hey guys, what's up? Chad Wesley Smith here. I'm going to bring you a new series. We're going to cover each scientific principle of training from our book by Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. James Hoffman, and myself, Scientific Principles of Strength Training. So we're going to go as in-depth as I can. So this will be a 7-video series, one video covering each topic, talking about what the principle is and basically how to correctly apply it to your training. So first, we're going to talk about the number one principle, the most important, specificity. And specificity is really the framework which all other principles are going to work within. So it's kind of an umbrella that encapsulates the rest of the principles. And as you look at applying the other principles, it all needs to be looked at through the lens of specificity. So specificity means basically at its core, training that is going to develop the underlying systems of the sporting task. And we're going to talk specifically about powerlifting, but understand that specificity is not unique to powerlifting, all right, or to strength sports. It could be applied to any training task, so any sporting task, football, MMA, whatever, all of those, you need to look at the framework of specificity unique to that sporting task and the underlying systems that are going to improve an athlete in that direction. So again, this video is going to be directed at powerlifting with powerlifting examples, but it can be applied across the board. You just have to kind of shift the focus of what it's specific to. So specificity for powerlifting, we're going to look at training the muscles involved in the movement, training the nervous system in the direction of the sporting movement, and of course, training the actual sporting movements themselves, the competitive exercise. So squat, bench, deadlift, wearing whatever supportive equipment you may wear for 1 rep is the most specific thing that you can do for the sport of powerlifting. Specificity exists within a spectrum, all right, from general to specific. It could be from very, very general, things that basically have nothing to do with powerlifting, like long distance running or running a marathon, up to the most specific thing, which again is the competitive exercise, squat, bench, or deadlift in your competitive equipment for 1 rep max. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to be looking at a pretty small part of that spectrum. So we'll really be talking about things that are not from general to specific necessarily, but from less to more specific. So specificity for powerlifting means that we are training to enhance the size of the muscles involved in powerlifting, and that's going to be relatively general, all right? Then training to improve general strength of those muscles, which is a little bit more focused. And finally, improving the technical execution of the competitive lifts themselves. And that's going to be really the most specific thing we can do to drive our success in powerlifting. So we're going to break specificity down into 4 categories, all right? That's going to be specific training that's going to very well support sport performance. So this would be training the competitive lifts and training them heavy and for relatively, for pretty low reps. So very, very specific training. Training that generally supports sport performance, so training for muscular size and general strength. And we can also split those top 2 categories up into subcategories. If you're familiar with the work of Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, he divides exercise into 5 categories: the competitive exercise, then special developmental, special preparatory, general developmental, and general preparatory. And if we wanted to go more in depth into categorizing exercises, that would be a definite way to do it, and I think a very effective way to do it. And Dr. Bondarchuk is the former national throws coach for the Soviet Union and has produced tremendously successful athletes, including the number 1 and number 2 hammer throwers of all time. He currently coaches out of Canada in a club called Kamloops, and if you're more interested in looking into his ideas about transfer of training, and he's really, kind of the godfather of special strength exercises, I would highly encourage you to check out any of his books, particularly Transfer of Training by Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. Then we go into two other categories. So training that is tangential to performance. So that would be like very involved mobility training, or just training that an elite powerlifter may, or qualities that they may have, but they're not necessarily correlated or the cause of their elite performance. So yeah, again, they may have it, but it's not responsible for their success. And finally, training that is so general, it may actually harm your progress. So that could be something like endurance training, where it's actually counterproductive to the qualities that you need for powerlifting. And excessive mobility or flexibility training could fall under that category, as well as the time you would need to devote to be like a contortionist would certainly be detracting from your ability to be successful in powerlifting. And then point number 4 there is going to go into the idea of training modality compatibility, and that's going to be the next point that we want to talk about, because there's training that pairs well together, and there's training that kind of counteracts each other. So that's the next point that we're going to discuss. So as we look at training modality compatibility, there's 5 main categories that we're going to look at, and I'll list these from least to most compatible. So the least compatible would be strength and endurance training paired together, then strength and flexibility training, strength and power training, strength and training for muscular size, so strength and bodybuilding training, and then general strength and specific strength training being the most compatible. So strength and endurance training, that's something that's become kind of more and more popular, hybrid type of training or CrossFit. And it's important to understand that some endurance training can have a positive effect on your powerlifting performance, but the amount of endurance training that's going to be is very, very minimal. Its benefits would come from increased general work capacity to also enhanced recovery ability between training sessions, or within even a single training session. So if you're like a huge out of shape fat ass and you have such poor aerobic capacity that you can't do a set of 10, or it's just hindering your maximum recoverable volume so much, then it would behoove you to include some level of aerobic training. And so you can do more quality training within the course of one training session, and improved aerobic capacity will also allow you to recover better from session to session. But the amount of aerobic capacity or amount of endurance training that you're going to do there is still very, very limited. I wouldn't even say it's to the point where you would be doing directed endurance training. So, and the real problems with doing too much endurance training is that endurance training will induce too much non-specific fatigue, and it's going to hinder your ability to train hard in the specific modalities because you're tired from other general work. So like I said, if you're really out of shape, it's probably worthwhile for you to take a step back from highly specific work and do a hypertrophy block, so doing multiple sets of 10 to 12 reps, or maybe to utilize some controlled rest periods, or to just go for like a 20 or 30 minute walk every day. That is the extent of the benefit of endurance or aerobic training to the competitive powerlifter. So endurance training also isn't compatible because it puts you in jeopardy of shifting your fiber type characteristics more from slow twitch more from fast twitch fiber type that you might have so these transitional fibers. And if you do a large volume of endurance work, you would risk shifting those transitional fibers to slow twitch fibers. And while this is largely reversible, it serves no purpose in the short term, and so no purpose in the short or long term. So the short term being lifting heavy weights right now, or in the long term of increasing muscle size to lift heavier weights in the future, because fast twitch fibers grow much larger than slow twitch fibers do. So you want to have and maximize, whatever fast twitch fibers you were given genetically, you want to maximize those. It's also common to violate specificity by doing too much endurance work or just inappropriate type of endurance work, and that sometimes is even kind of masqueraded as powerlifting training, like pushing the prowler or pulling the sled. And while those can play a role, if they're applied correctly with, alactic aerobic work done in very, very small volumes, going to catch the prowler flu or, just high volumes of sled work is actually going to be counterproductive from the standpoint of fatigue management as well as fiber type conversion. So understand that if you want to pursue strength and endurance together because you enjoy doing that, by all means, go ahead and do that. Just do it with the understanding that it's not the most optimal training you can do for powerlifting. The next training pairing on our list of compatibility would be strength and flexibility training. So flexibility is the total range of motion that a joint or multiple joints is capable of moving through. And flexibility and mobility are often used kind of interchangeably, and there seems to be more and more increasing focus on mobility training, but that's really only half the equation when you're looking at proper movement, which is going to be a spectrum of mobility to stability. But because I'm not the expert, the Juggernaut expert in movement training, I'm just going to refer you to Dr. Quinn Hennock, who's much better equipped to discuss this topic. So make sure you refer to his videos, What is Tightness and Why Stretching Isn't the Answer. Those will give you a lot better insight there, and the video links are below in the info. Just know that the necessary level of flexibility training for powerlifting success is, the amount of training you need to do for that is pretty limited. So training the lifts through a full range of motion, sometimes training them through a extended range of motion like a deficit deadlift or just like really deep Olympic pause squats, plus some directed movement work like the stuff that Quinn will outline in those videos, that's going to be sufficient as far as strength and flexibility training goes for it to have some positive correlation to your powerlifting success. So the final three pairs, strength with power training, strength with muscular size training, and general strength along with specific strength training, those are all highly compatible with powerlifting success, so we're not going to talk too much about those. So now that we've talked about training modality compatibility, that brings us to the next big point within specificity, and that's the idea of directed adaptation. And the concept of directed adaptation builds on the idea of specificity, in which specificity means stressing the underlying systems of the sporting task. Directed adaptation goes another step further and puts an emphasis on the sequential stressing of those systems. And that's something that we're going to talk in depth about in a future video when we discuss SRA and phase potentiation. So now that we understand what specificity is, the next question we want to answer is how can we correctly apply it to our training? And one of the most important and the best understood or most discussed aspect of specificity and how it applies to our training is going to be in our exercise selection. So properly choosing exercises based on their specificity has to also do with the time where you are during your training, because more general exercises and more general loading schemes, so you got to understand that specificity is not just the exercise but also the way the exercise is performed. Less specific variations may have a proper application further away from your competition. So again, the most specific exercise you can do is the squat, bench, or deadlift with your competitive equipment on for a 1 rep max. So any change in that, whether it be a change in bar position, change in grip width, change in the pace or the timing of the lift, or changes in the loading, like doing 2 reps of an exercise is less specific than doing 1 rep. Doing 3 reps, doing 4 reps, 5 on, and so on and so forth is continually less and less specific. But that less specific training, like hypertrophy training, sets of 6 to 12 reps, has its place and is very important to the grand scheme of your performance. So, a lot of people will argue for specificity, saying, for kind of the over application of specificity, saying, well, if you only had a month to squat as much as you could, what kind of training would you do? Of course, you would do the most specific training possible then. You would do like a Bulgarian style squatting and, squat to a max every single day. But in the reality of the world, we are not confined to the idea of, you have to get as strong as you can this month. We have, weeks and months and years and potentially decades to build and improve this strength. So in that, you want to do long-term training that's going to set you up for the most success, not just this week or this month, but this year, this quadrennial, however it gets broken up for you. So in doing that, we want to move from less specific to more specific over the course of a training cycle, over the course of an annual plan, a quadrennial, and an entire training career. It's going to kind of go general, more specific, then compete, then go back to general, and so on and so forth. So proper application of specificity can actually mean that when you're in a hypertrophy block, selecting an exercise like a high bar squat, assuming you're a low bar competitive squatter, and doing it for sets of 8, 10, and 12 reps would actually be a proper application, because that's what's most specific to your goals in that phase of training. Even though it may not be the competitive exercise, as long as you're doing that at the appropriate times, that would be a proper application of specificity. So I think a lot of people too who get caught up in this over application of specificity, wanting to do just the competitive exercises and do it just for very low rep schemes, they're also missing out on hypertrophy, because that's best developed with higher rep ranges. They're missing out on general strength, which is going to be best developed in those moderate rep ranges. And they're going to run the risk of overuse injuries, not fully developing musculature that could be helping them with the lifts, because if your quads are weak, are the relative weak point of your squat, and you keep low bar squatting, you're never specifically overloading your quads to give them the stimulus they need to come up to par with the rest of your musculature. So different exercise variations are going to have their application there. Of course, you also have to consider the other side of that as exercises become too far away from the competitive exercise, they're going to have less and less carryover. And I think that's where a lot of people run into trouble with changing their exercise variation every week, or getting into the use of specialty bars, or using that stuff too close to competition. And all of those things could potentially have application. It just needs to be timed properly, and the proper timing for safety squat bar, which I'm using in my training right now, is not 2 and 3 weeks out from meets. It's 3 and 4 months out, maybe to work around an injury, or to use in place of a front squat or as a high bar squat variation, and develop more quads, and in my case, let me work around the shoulder injury. But besides those potential pitfalls of an over application of specificity, you would also run into the issue of staleness from both a psychological and physiological standpoint. So if you just do 1 rep max, 1 rep max, 1 rep max in the same squat variation every single day, it's probably going to kind of drive you crazy. And make sure you guys check out the interview we did with Max Ada, A Squatting Life, and he talks about squatting to a max basically every day for about 13 years, and kind of the psychological struggles and that came along with that style of training. So not only is it going to get boring and probably affect your motivation, it's also going to cause the physiological staleness, in which the returns on your training are just being diminished over time. And this all goes hand in hand. That's going to happen because you're not developing hypertrophy enough and not developing general strength enough. And just the longer you use one method, the less effective it's going to become. But again, that's talking in pretty broad, fairly long term. That you could use the same style of training for years and years and years and make small adjustments within them, like the adjustments we're talking about here with different phases, and for it to continue to be effective. But the longer one phase goes, a hypertrophy phase, let's say if you try to take a hypertrophy phase out for an entire year, the gains in the last quarter of that year would be very insignificant compared to the gains in the first quarter. So again, as we're looking at correctly applying specificity in terms of exercise selection, the closer to a meet you get, the more important it is that you're practicing the competitive lifts at very low rep ranges. Because our number one goal there is going to be developing technical prowess and honing those neural abilities for the 1 rep max. So it's all about timing. You want to do exercise variations, you want to do higher reps and stuff, that's great. That's important to training. It's just important that it's properly timed. You want to keep that stuff a little bit farther away from the competition and just properly phase your training out. The other important aspect to consider when focusing on trying to apply specificity correctly to your training is what the role of assistance work is within the grand scheme of your training. So assistance work is of course important to training and long-term success, even though it is inherently more general or less specific type of training. So what you need to do is continually ask yourself, how is this helping improve my competitive lifts when you're looking at selecting different assistance exercises to include in your program? And for them to be optimal, they really need to either answer the question, or for them to be optimal, they either need to be developing muscular size or movement strength. And also understand that the variations that you select within assistance work need to be different enough from the competitive movement to introduce novel stimulus. Because if they were too close, they wouldn't, overload the specific musculature that you are trying to develop, whether that's for hypertrophic gains or for general strength gains. Well, there you go. That's a overview of specificity for you. If you want to go more in depth to these ideas, please check out Scientific Principles of Strength Training by Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. James Hoffman, and myself, and my own book, A Thoughtful Pursuit of Strength, both available at jtsstrength.com. Make sure you guys subscribe to the video, and thanks for watching.
You've got work capacity factored in, and recoverability, you now have your maximum recoverable volume. There are some implications for how to program your training for maximum recoverable volume. One of the biggest implications is, by definition, training has to be to some extent individualized. That means if you see Ronnie Coleman's program online, are you Ronnie Coleman? Ronnie stands up from the back of the crowd, like, yes, oh, sorry, sir. For everyone else, this does not apply. So is Ronnie Coleman getting better recovery than you? Chances are. Right? Professional bodybuilders have a career of this stuff. A lot of times they can eat a whole bunch of food, get all the sleep, etc., etc., etc. So if you try to replicate their training routines and their maximum recoverable volumes are higher than yours, what's going to happen is your maximum recoverable volume is not that high. Your training routine that's up here, what do you guys think is going to happen after a couple of weeks or even maybe a couple of days? You're going to start to overreach, then maybe you start to overtrain, you get sore knees, and you're like, oh man, I couldn't do it, I couldn't handle the volume. Greg Knuckles back there wrote an awesome manual on Bulgarian approach to strength training, which requires relatively high volumes and frequencies. And one of the big things he keeps saying all the time, and Nobody really listens, according to Facebook comments. Maybe half the people listen, half just want to critique, right? And they'll be like, oh, nobody can survive this. You work into that kind of approach. You don't just show up and go, I've never lifted before. How about I squat for 5 sets of heavy singles every day? Seems like a good idea. Training has to be individualized. You have to know what your own maximum recoverable volume is approximately. How do we know that? How much work can we do and still recover well enough for the next week's session? If you do a certain total volume, sets times reps times weight per week, right? The next week you come in and you're like, I feel great. I don't feel like anything even happened. You're training too easy. If you come in the next week and you're like, man, that was tough, but I'm going again, and you hit all your reps again and hit, overload, put a bit more weight on the bar, add some sets, and you're still going, great, you're close to your MRV. What does it feel like when we're over our maximum recoverable volume? What does that next week of training feel like? Feels awful, and a lot of times you can't even do the reps. Have you guys ever come in for a workout that's supposed to be 3 sets of 10, and you hit 10, 7, 3 reps? You're like, well, that didn't go so well. Okay, I'll just lower the weight. That's what I'll do, right? Because that's how we get stronger. So if you train over your MRV consistently, nothing good happens. When a good power lifter or bodybuilder or strongman or whoever, Olympic weightlifter, whoever program you're emulating, you can emulate the program just fine. Just make sure to modify the number of sets. That's the easiest way to do that, right? So their structure of when they do heavy and light work, the particular body parts they're training could be excellent, and you can learn a lot from it. Just don't try to do the same number of sets. Here's another consideration, all right? When you get really, really big and strong, the intensity, the weight on the bar is so high that the total number of sets you can do and still survive or recover is really low. So that if we were to take Stan Efferding's program or Chad Wesley Smith's program and run it verbatim for 120-pound powerlifters, are they squatting 800 or 900 pounds in training? No. So these guys can come in and do 2 heavy squat workouts per month, and that's more than enough. That is their MRV at that intensity. Is the same thing applying to 120-pound people who squat 115 on the bar? Okay, they can do 5 times the work and still recover. So it goes both ways. Sometimes good athletes have maximum recoverable volumes we can never hope to achieve, but maybe at our peak. But sometimes they're so big and strong, their MRVs are actually lower because they're using such heavy weights. So the bottom line is individualization is absolutely critical in that regard. Right? How many of you guys are coaches? Holy crap, this point is going to be made a lot better than I thought. 3 people are going to raise their hands. When you're training a group of athletes, do not program the same sets and reps for everybody. People need different schemes. Some people, let's say 3x10 is kind of the workout we want to throw out. Some of your athletes, 3x10 will be perfect. For some, and I'm sure you guys have had this experience, 3x10 wrecks a couple of athletes. They get so sore they can't get out of bed. For others, right, they do 6x10 and still don't feel a thing. And then come back the next day and do 6x10. So while your repetition scheme and your general structure should be the same for all of your athletes or very similar, you have to make sure to program slightly different volumes to their ability to recover. Does that make sense?